Under the stillness of a cloudless Arizona morning, Nora Wells sat at her dining table, the rhythmic beeping of her dialysis monitor echoing quietly through the house. The air carried the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint aroma of ground coffee, long since cold. Her modest single-story home, painted in subdued desert tones, stood near the edge of a newly built HOA-controlled development marketed as a smart energy community. Nora hadn't chosen the neighborhood for the social appeal or the sense of community. It was the infrastructure that had convinced her. The marketing brochures boasted state-of-the-art grid reliability, optimized climate control systems, and adaptive energy regulation. For someone like her, dependent on precise, uninterrupted electricity for daily peritoneal dialysis treatments, those promises had sounded less like luxury and more like survival. She moved into the house just over a year ago, after a lengthy application process and medical clearance that allowed her to qualify for a federal home health program. Her condition, an aggressive autoimmune nephropathy, meant her kidneys no longer filtered toxins effectively. Every morning at precisely 6:30, her machine started cycling fluid in and out of her abdomen. A single blackout, a power surge, or a voltage dip at the wrong moment could mean nausea, disorientation, or worse. That's why the neighborhood's infrastructure, supposedly stabilized through HOA-monitored energy distribution, had seemed ideal. But Nora wasn't naive. She had worked in toxicology labs for nearly 2 decades and knew that behind every guarantee there was fine print waiting to redefine it. That awareness never left her. It just went dormant when the days were quiet and routine. Now, though, it had started to hum again. Over the past month, her electric bills had been shrinking, not a result of conservation, but actual reduction in kilowatt-hour usage. At first, she thought it was a billing error, but when she called the municipal utility, they informed her that her home had been migrated to a private load balancing circuit managed under the HOA's recently activated Localized Smart Grid Pilot program. It sounded innocuous, even progressive. But Nora hadn't consented to any such transfer, and, more importantly, she hadn't received a single official notice about it. No letters, no emails. Just a friendly pamphlet tucked under her door weeks ago that she had dismissed as promotional fluff. She retrieved it from a drawer and reread it now with sharpened eyes. It spoke in vague, overly technical terms about resource harmonization, resilient load tiering, and disruption mitigation models, but nowhere did it explain that certain homes would be deprioritized during high-load periods. Nowhere did it mention medical exemptions. That morning, as she sat connected to her machine, she noticed the screen flicker, just once, just briefly, but enough to make her blood run cold. She logged the incident, unplugged the device after the cycle completed, and immediately began compiling her paperwork. Her medical authorizations, her utility history, the HOA's public charter, and every scrap of documentation she could find relating to the Energy Pilot program were laid out like a mosaic on her kitchen island. Something was shifting in the shadows of this optimized neighborhood, and she needed to see the full picture before the next flicker became something permanent. It happened at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Nora wasn't asleep. She rarely slept deeply anymore, but she was lying on her side, letting the low mechanical hum of her dialysis machine anchor her in the dark. Her bedroom was cool, dry, and sterile, just the way she liked it. Outside, the desert wind brushed softly against the windows. Then, without warning, the machine emitted a shrill, stuttering tone that didn't belong. Nora's body jerked upright instinctively. The screen was flashing red. Cycle interrupted. Power failure detected. The ceiling fan slowed, then stopped. Her bedside lamp was dead. The air was instantly heavier, more fragile, like the room had stopped breathing. The silence that followed was too complete, too surgical. She felt the panic blooming in her chest before her brain caught up to it. She reached for her phone, but even the charger light was off. Dead. She scrambled toward the hallway, still connected to the machine by the catheter, then ripped it loose without finishing the cycle, wincing as a dull pressure stabbed at her abdomen. She reached the circuit breaker in the garage with trembling hands, but nothing was tripped. The breakers stood untouched, like statues mocking her urgency. She threw open the side door and stepped barefoot into the gravel, scanning the neighborhood. Porch lights still glowed across the cul-de-sac. Garden fixtures blinked gently in automated harmony. Her neighbors' homes remained illuminated, quiet, untouched. The outage was not universal. It was not even a neighborhood glitch. It was her house, only hers. Stumbling back inside, she grabbed the manual power backup unit, a clunky emergency device she'd only ever used during storms in her old apartment. It provided enough electricity for one more cycle, no more than 4 hours of operation. She reconnected the machine, started the rinse, and sat still, the pressure in her chest slowly giving way to a colder, deeper realization. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had cut her power, surgically, precisely, with the knowledge of what that would mean for her. At dawn, she went out to check the meter box only to find the access panel secured with a tamper-proof lock. It hadn't been there the day before. Attached was a weatherproof envelope, folded crisply and sealed with a green HOA emblem. Inside was a single page, printed in small font and signed electronically at the bottom. Notice of Electrical Infrastructure Realignment. As part of our community's transition to sustainable load-tiered energy management, your address has been designated for temporary disconnect due to unverified equipment exceeding approved energy profile thresholds. Reconnection will be reviewed upon compliance certification. There was no phone number, no name, no department listed. Only a QR code, which, when scanned, led to a login page that required an HOA-issued access key Nora never received. Her heart thudded in her ears. She wasn't just fighting a power failure, she had been silently labeled as non-compliant. She returned to the kitchen and called the municipal utility again. This time, a recorded voice told her that her meter was no longer managed by the city and that all service inquiries must be directed to Community Grid Services LLC, a private partner of the HOA. She called the number listed on their website. After 6 rings, a calm male voice answered, introducing himself as Kyle from Client Facilitation. When she explained the situation, there was a pause long enough to make her think the call had dropped. Then Kyle said without a hint of irony, "We're aware of the status alert for that address. System review determined that your usage patterns are irregular and required escalation. You should have received a compliance packet." "I didn't receive anything," she said. "I have a federally registered medical exemption. This isn't a discretionary issue. I am not using irregular equipment. I'm using a dialysis machine approved and subsidized by the state's health department. Unfortunately, our system flags non-conforming draw behaviors based on frequency and sustained peak consumption. I can't override the flag without an engineering compliance audit, which must be initiated by the HOA." Nora didn't scream. She didn't even curse. She thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence for 10 full minutes. Then she began writing. Emails, formal complaints, requests for audit documentation, all structured in the precise, dispassionate tone she had perfected over years of scientific reporting. By the end of the afternoon, she had submitted 7 formal requests to the HOA's online portal, copied to their umbrella management company, and initiated a complaint through the State Public Utility Commission. She expected delays. She didn't expect what arrived the next morning. A courier, not from the post office, not in a company uniform, just a polite man in beige slacks and a windbreaker, handed her a flat envelope and left without saying a word. Inside, printed on heavy cardstock, was a formal infraction notice from the HOA Disciplinary Committee. The wording was polite, the font elegant, but the meaning was unmistakable. Nora Wells was being cited for unauthorized medical equipment installation, failure to disclose infrastructural modifications, and disruption of community energy. Equilibrium. There were no fines listed yet. But the letter noted that repeated violations could result in restrictive action, including further service limitation, lien issuance, or property compliance reassessment. Nora laughed aloud, once sharply. Then she sat back down and reopened every file. She traced her approval forms, the ADA documentation, her physician's original installation sign-off, even the official correspondence from the health department's in-home treatment division. It was all there, and none of it mattered. Not to them. The HOA wasn't asking for clarification. They had already decided she was in the wrong. They had turned her house from a safe haven into a monitored node on a private grid, and they were using the soft language of regulation to justify something fundamentally brutal. She could no longer wait for the state. She needed someone who could act quickly, someone who could speak their language, someone who could press exactly the right pressure points. And she needed them now. Nora didn't storm into the HOA building. She walked through the glass doors with the quiet, deliberate calm of someone who already knew the people inside were not going to help her. The office was in a converted model home at the edge of the neighborhood. Too pristine to be functional, citrus-scented air, synthetic smiles on the reception staff, and silence so curated it hummed. A young woman behind the desk greeted her with mechanical warmth, asked for her name, then typed something unseen behind the screen before excusing herself to check availability. Nora didn't sit. She stared at the framed posters on the wall. Words like synergy, shared responsibility, and community optimization floated above cheerful stock photos of potlucks and garden walks, images that bore no resemblance to the indifferent, surveillance-coded development she now called home. After 10 minutes, the receptionist returned and led her to a narrow office at the end of the hall. Waiting for her was a man who looked as if he had been plucked from a catalog. Beige suit, hair combed so tightly you could measure rainfall on it, and hands folded precisely on the desk in front of him. He rose when she entered and offered his hand. Ms. Wells, Edgar Pines, acting president of the board. His voice was smooth, gentle, and stripped of inflection, as though whatever emotion had once been there had long since been replaced by protocol. She didn't take his hand. "I'm here about the power shutoff," she said, sitting before being invited. "I'm on dialysis. Your private grid disabled my medical equipment. That was not only reckless, it was unlawful." Edgar nodded slowly, the kind of nod that wasn't agreement, but prelude. "We are, of course, aware of the incident," he said, "and let me express, as a representative of the board, that we regret any discomfort you may have experienced. However, we must consider the needs of the entire community. Your residence was flagged as part of an energy deviation review." "There is no deviation," she interrupted. "My equipment is state-approved, registered, and has been in place since before the HOA took over grid management. You know that. I submitted full documentation before moving in." "Yes," he said with a measured breath, "and those documents are on file. However, our smart infrastructure operates on a dynamic balance model. During peak load moments, certain homes are temporarily deprioritized to maintain overall grid integrity. This isn't about targeting individuals, Ms. Wells. It's about systemic equilibrium." Nora's fists clenched, but she didn't raise her voice. "So you're telling me that systemic equilibrium means risking someone's life? That your grid prioritizes lawn irrigation and outdoor lighting over medical devices?" Edgar's gaze didn't flinch. "Our contract with the energy partner includes adaptive tiering based on consumption categories. Unfortunately, medical exemptions were not listed in the default framework. That's something we're looking into amending. I suggest, in the meantime, you file a formal waiver request I already have," she said. 7 of them, and I've contacted the State Public Utility Commission." Now, for the first time, Edgar blinked. A pause. Brief, but real. "Of course," he replied. "You are within your rights to explore state-level inquiries. But the HOA operates as a private governance body under civil charter. We're not bound to the same review mechanisms. Our internal policies are recognized under the community's foundational deed covenant. And how exactly do those policies justify sealing my meter box and replacing the lock without notification?" "That was a safety measure," he said evenly. "Some residents tamper with meters to avoid tiered billing. It's a standard practice to secure access points during audit cycles." "I'm not some resident," she snapped. "I'm a patient, and your audit nearly killed me." Edgar smiled. It was faint, controlled, and terrifying in its softness. "I understand this is frustrating," he said, "but you must also understand the board's responsibility to the collective. Individual hardship, while unfortunate, cannot compromise system stability." Nora stood. She didn't speak again. She didn't shake his hand on the way out, and she didn't look at the receptionist as she passed through the quiet, sunlit lobby. Her thoughts burned so hot they felt icy, clean, and focused. She didn't have time to fight this with outrage or pleading. She needed precision. She needed to hit their charter where it hurt, not emotionally, but structurally. That night, her mailbox contained another envelope, sealed with the same green HOA emblem. This one wasn't a warning. It was a demand. She was now required to attend a compliance hearing, scheduled for the following Monday, where she would be allowed to present justification for non-conforming infrastructure and be considered for conditional reinstatement to full access. Privileges. It read like a trial, and it would be held not in court, not in public, but in the very same converted model home where Edgar had just lectured her about equilibrium. She stayed up until 3 a.m. combing through HOA charters, state regulations on private grid systems, community energy legislation, and case law involving limited service access to medical needs. But most of all, she looked for people. Not allies, experts. She didn't need someone to feel bad for her. She needed someone who understood the exact boundaries between corporate governance and state-licensed infrastructure. The HOA thought they operated in a vacuum. She would show them otherwise. By morning, she had an appointment scheduled with Joan Barry, a legal strategist known for dissecting private infrastructure contracts like scalpels through bone. She wasn't cheap, but she didn't need to be. Nora had saved every emergency fund she'd ever built for moments like this. Not for illness, but for injustice pretending to be process. And something else had shifted. The second time her dialysis machine flickered, around 7:10 a.m., it recovered almost instantly, but the surge left a scar, a red code she hadn't seen before. Foreign sync protocol detected. Someone, somewhere in the system, had started interacting with her equipment. Not just observing it, syncing with it. It wasn't just her power they were manipulating now. It was control, and she'd just begun her counterattack. Joan Barry didn't dress like a lawyer and didn't act like one either. She wore jeans, not slacks, spoke in paragraphs, not prepared statements. Her office was a converted storage loft above a taxidermy shop, deliberately unremarkable, strategically located far from the glossy corporate complexes HOA board members frequented. She had spent 20 years navigating legal corridors too narrow for mainstream law firms, private governance law, utility overreach, HOA overregulation, and infrastructural arbitration. She didn't argue cases in court. She dismantled them in administrative rooms and arbitration panels long before trial became necessary. When Nora walked in, clutching her folders like they were weapons, Joan didn't ask for an opening summary. She simply motioned for her to sit and said, "Let's get to the bones." Nora laid out everything. The tamper lock on her breaker box, the infraction notices, the laughable hearing, and the sudden silence from every regulatory body she'd filed. Complaints with? Then came the documents. The health department approvals, medical exemptions, pre-HOA installation permits, and power usage logs. Joan listened in silence, nodding occasionally, her eyes darting between pages like a codebreaker scanning a cipher. When Nora finally stopped, expecting questions or a sigh, Joan just leaned back in her chair and said, "You're not the first." That sentence hit harder than Nora expected. Not the first, not special, not even particularly exceptional in the world of HOA overreach. They've been trying this smart grid garbage in pilot communities across the state, Joan said. Energy privatization wrapped in sustainable jargon. It starts with reduced bills. Then comes tiered access. Then enforcement disguised as load balancing. It's control through infrastructure. "So what do I do?" Nora asked. "You don't fight it directly," Joan replied. "You go after the foundation." HOA charters are built on continuity, renewed licensing, transparent governance, and fiduciary maintenance. You crack the charter, you collapse their standing to enforce any of this. What you experienced isn't just abuse of discretion, it's structural negligence. Joan began pulling up records from her database. Homeowners Association license filings, charter renewal dates, utility subcontracts. Within minutes, she found what she needed. Your HOA filed for renewal of operational infrastructure management last year, she said, but the filing doesn't match the approval window granted by the State Infrastructure Board. Their authority lapsed for 6 weeks before reinstatement. During that time, they executed 5 structural policy changes, including the transition to a private energy partner. That means every enforcement action executed in that period is technically void. And if they didn't disclose the lapse to the homeowners, that's breach of fiduciary transparency. Nora's pulse quickened. So, the shut-off, the lock, the citations, all invalid. And that, Joan said with a smile, is our scalpel. They spent the next 3 days building a dossier, not a complaint, but a full procedural audit. Joan drafted a notice of administrative petition addressed to the State HOA Oversight Board, citing breach of charter renewal procedure, unlawful infrastructure manipulation, failure to notify residents of charter status lapse, and unauthorized privatization of regulated utilities. It wasn't written like a plea. It was written like a demolition order. Meanwhile, Nora returned home and found her mailbox stuffed with another envelope. This time, it wasn't green. It was white, thick, and embossed. An invitation. The HOA had scheduled a Resolution and Mediation Forum for select residents concerned about infrastructure developments. It would be held at the community clubhouse, complete with light refreshments and a guest speaker from the Energy Partners leadership team. Beneath the polite veneer, it was a pressure valve, an attempt to neutralize dissent by softening it with hospitality. Nora didn't respond. She didn't plan to attend. She didn't need pastries and slideshow presentations. She needed leverage. But she wasn't done uncovering. That evening, after another power flicker disrupted her treatment session, this one accompanied by a 2-minute reboot delay, she examined the diagnostics of her machine. Deep in the logs, she found something new. Remote latency detected. Address origin unverified. Her machine was detecting attempts to access or sync with its firmware, likely through the smart grid's external diagnostic feed. It wasn't just flagging power fluctuation anymore. It was detecting external pings. She disconnected the machine manually and spent the next 2 hours running a firmware diagnostic from her laptop. There were no infections, no breaches, just a repeated attempt at access, flagged under a system signature labeled HOAADMIN01. It was audacious, reckless, possibly criminal. She called Joan immediately. "This changes things," Joan said after listening. "We're not just talking infrastructure negligence. If they're accessing medical devices through power sync feeds, we're entering regulatory violation territory. HIPAA crossover. You could take this to the state health board." But Joan wasn't interested in drama. She was interested in results. "Let's stay focused. We hit them on the breach of charter first. If they're invalidated, every system they created goes with them. The grid contract, the enforcement actions, the budget allocations. You don't just beat them. You erase the framework." The petition was submitted 2 days later. Joan filed it under emergency review status, citing potential endangerment of life and immediate need for suspension of enforcement authority. They didn't need to win immediately. They just needed the board to pause HOA activity until the matter was reviewed, a moratorium on their power, both literal and administrative. That same day, Nora received an email, not from the HOA, not from Joan, from a neighbor she didn't know, an older man named Raymond, 3 streets over. The message was brief. "Saw your name on the agenda for the hearing. Wanted you to know you're not alone. They tried the same thing with my solar array. Called it unauthorized hardware, cut the feed for a week. Thought you should see this?" Attached was a document, a scanned page from a previous HOA newsletter, distributed months before Nora had moved in. The page listed early-stage compliance audits of selected addresses. Her address was there. So was Raymond's. So were 10 others. It wasn't random enforcement. It was targeted infrastructure isolation, plotted in advance, buried under the language of pilot program evaluations. Nora replied with 2 words. "Thank you." Then she sent the file to Joan, who added it to the petition as supplementary evidence of premeditated enforcement planning. They didn't attend the hearing. They didn't respond to the latest HOA citation, which now included a per diem maintenance fee for the locked meter box, and they didn't answer the phone when a community liaison called to check in. They waited, and when the state board finally responded, it wasn't with a delay notice or a generic acknowledgement. It was with a temporary suspension order. Effective immediately, the HOA's authority to enforce any infrastructural action was frozen. Their grid partnership contract was placed under administrative review. Their charter renewal documentation was subpoenaed for internal audit. Joan forwarded the notice to Nora with a single line. They blinked. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Not through protest, not through confrontation, but through precise exposure. The middle point of the battle wasn't marked by a fiery speech or dramatic standoff. It came quietly, in the form of a scanned signature from a state official validating the unspoken truth. The HOA was no longer in control. Now, the real unraveling could begin. The morning after the suspension order was issued, Nora woke not to silence but to the hollow chime of her doorbell. She had only just disconnected from her dialysis machine, her body aching with the lingering fatigue that always followed a long cycle. The ring came again, deliberate, not rushed, not impatient, but with a rhythm that felt studied. When she opened the door, a man in a city-issued utility vest stood on her porch, clipboard in hand. His badge identified him as a municipal power auditor. His tone was courteous, almost apologetic, and he explained that he was there to perform a courtesy inspection of properties affected by the HOA's suspended energy program. It sounded like a cover story, something pre-written to avoid friction. But she let him in anyway, watching every step he took. He didn't touch her equipment. He didn't take photos. He simply checked the meter, jotted something down, then paused before leaving. "Off the record," he said, lowering his voice as if the walls might report him. "We've had 3 other complaints like yours in this zone. Different issues. Solar interference, unauthorized shutoffs, phantom charges, but they all start the same way. private control over what should be public infrastructure. Someone upstream is pushing this hard. You rattled them." He gave her a grim smile, handed her a copy of his inspection note, and left without another word. She hadn't needed confirmation that her case was bigger than one address, but hearing it from someone outside her circle tightened the knot of tension across her shoulders. This wasn't over. It was mutating. Within 24 hours, the HOA board issued an open letter to all residents, carefully worded, neatly formatted, and full of passive voice. They didn't mention the state suspension directly. Instead, they cited a temporary review phase prompted by unforeseen administrative inconsistencies. They framed the pause in authority as a proactive compliance step, emphasizing their unwavering commitment to community integrity. It was the linguistic equivalent of a smokescreen, and most residents would probably skim it, nod, and toss it. But Nora read it 10 times, dissecting every phrase. Nowhere did they admit to wrongdoing. Nowhere did they acknowledge the power shutoffs or the illegal installations. Instead, they introduced a new idea, a transition committee composed of homeowners and technical partners, meant to ensure transparent collaboration during the resolution period. It was a distraction maneuver, a buffer, a way to redirect heat away from the board by distributing it laterally. And then came the retaliatory strike. 3 days after the suspension, a flat, sealed envelope appeared taped to her front door. No postage, no return address, no logo, just her name in typed, centered font. Inside was a notice of lien filing. According to the document, the HOA had imposed a maintenance lien on her property, citing continued obstruction of infrastructural access and unpaid compliance review surcharges. The lien was backdated to a week before the state order. It was thinly veiled aggression dressed up in bureaucratic teeth. Nora forwarded the document to Joan, who responded within the hour. "This isn't just illegal. It's offensive. They're trying to provoke a mistake. Don't give it to them." But Nora didn't intend to give them anything. Not space, not silence, and certainly not fear. That same day, she and Joan filed a secondary petition, this time to the county recorder's office and the Consumer Protection Bureau, citing attempted fraudulent lien placement in violation of a state freeze. They added a formal request for legal investigation into potential HOA document falsification, and they copied both filings to the State Bar's Ethics Committee, requesting oversight of the board's in-house counsel. The mood around the neighborhood began to shift. It wasn't loud or visible at first. It was subtle, clipped greetings on the street, lowered voices among walking groups, residents lingering just a little longer by their mailboxes as if waiting for something. Raymond, the neighbor who'd first reached out to her, sent another message. 4 people have asked me if you're suing the board. I told them the truth. You're doing what they were too afraid to start." Others followed, short notes of quiet solidarity. One woman slid a post-it through her mail slot. "I'm with you." They killed our rainwater system and called it efficiency. A man she'd never met emailed her a single screenshot, his surveillance camera footage of a man in HOA gear unplugging his backup generator during a supposed noise inspection. Then came the anonymous packet. It was left in a nondescript envelope on her porch. Inside were internal HOA emails, printed, time-stamped, and redacted only for personal addresses. One email thread between board members discussed a non-compliant resident protocol, listing strategies for enforcement acceleration against difficult homeowners. Her address was mentioned directly. Another thread referred to a data compatibility sweep conducted by the energy partner, targeting medical and non-standard electronic equipment connected to the grid. The most damning line came from Edgar Pines himself. "We cannot allow residents to opt out of the grid transition. If necessary, we frame non-compliance as safety risk. Isolation is leverage." Nora's stomach turned as she read it, not from surprise, but from the cold confirmation of what she had long suspected. They hadn't just targeted her as an outlier. They had engineered a system in which her existence was already incompatible by design. She sent the documents to Joan, who replied with uncharacteristic brevity, "They're cooked. Prepare for fallout." But Nora didn't feel victorious. She felt exposed. That night, her backup power system, separate from the house grid, fully legal and installed months ago, malfunctioned. Not failed. Malfunctioned. The system diagnostic log showed a sudden firmware rollback, one that could not have been initiated locally. A rollback that had disabled the unit's auto-switch function, meaning her dialysis machine would not have reactivated if the main power had failed again. She caught it in time only because she had started checking the logs every morning like clockwork. This wasn't sabotage by a rogue technician or some HOA contractor drunk on power. This was institutional. It was calculated. It was a digital noose tightening slowly around her life under the guise of load balancing and administrative procedure. They were cornered, and now they were clawing back. Joan warned her, "They're trying to create grounds to reassert jurisdiction. If they can show you're a technical hazard, they'll argue emergency reauthorization of their charter under safety clause exemptions. This next phase isn't about legitimacy. It's about optics." The strategy shifted again. Nora began to record everything: log files, security footage, even audio from her interactions with delivery personnel. She installed a third-party voltage monitor that tracked every flicker of the line. She submitted those reports directly to the Office of Consumer Utilities. Joan helped her draft a sworn affidavit cataloging every retaliatory act since the suspension. They were building a case not just for revocation, but for legal dissolution. The second escalation wasn't louder than the first. It was colder, more surgical. A war fought not with signs or protests, but with metadata and redacted PDFs. Nora wasn't just a resident anymore. She was a node, a threat to a system that mistook silence for compliance and underestimated what it meant to be methodical. And as the pressure mounted, so did her resolve. She wasn't here to win a battle. She was preparing to bury the war machine. The hearing wasn't announced publicly. No flyers, no newsletter bulletins, no entry on the HOA's digital dashboard. And yet, somehow, nearly 24 residents showed up that morning at the county administrative building, quietly ushered into the beige municipal hearing room where the fate of their homeowners association was about to be decided. Nora arrived 15 minutes early, documents in hand, flanked by Joan Barry, whose calm demeanor disguised the arsenal of procedural knives hidden in her briefcase. On the other side of the room sat Edgar Pines and 2 other board members, accompanied by their counsel, a stiff, uncomfortable man in a pinstripe suit whose body language already read like retreat. The atmosphere was quiet, clinical, but under it pulsed a dense pressure that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. The state panel overseeing the hearing included 2 infrastructure auditors, 1 legal analyst, and a representative from the Department of Consumer Utility Oversight. These were not people who cared for speeches. They cared for violations, dates, signatures, and omissions. Joan stood first, presenting their primary petition, a 36-page dossier that outlined the HOA's failure to renew its infrastructure charter before implementing regulatory actions, their unlawful assumption of grid control, the manipulation of service tiers without homeowner consent, and the targeted isolation of medically dependent residents under the guise of energy optimization. Then came the secondary petition, focused on retaliatory behavior post-suspension, the fraudulent lien placement, unauthorized firmware access attempts, and the suppression of individual utility access in violation of ADA protections. Joan didn't dramatize. She didn't raise her voice. She simply read and displayed. Exhibits were numbered, timestamps laid bare, emails projected on the screen like evidence in a quiet criminal trial. The room never erupted. It didn't need to. The silence grew heavier with every minute that passed. When Edgar finally spoke, his words were like a thin varnish on rotted wood. He insisted that the board had acted in good faith, that the energy partner was a vetted contractor, that all changes were properly disclosed through available HOA channels. But the state analyst cut him off with a single question. "Can you produce the vote record authorizing the energy transition during your charter lapse?" Edgar blinked. He shuffled papers. He deferred to counsel. The answer never came. It didn't need to, because at that moment, the panel already had what it needed. The chairwoman of the oversight board requested that both parties step outside while the panel conferred. Nora didn't speak as they waited in the hallway. Joan leaned against the wall, reviewing nothing, her calm unshaken. "They'll suspend enforcement indefinitely," she said. "What we want is dissolution. That depends on whether the state wants to make an example of them." 20 minutes passed. When they were called back in, the air in the room had changed. Not tension, resolution. The lead auditor addressed the room with the flatness of finality. Due to documented violations of charter integrity, breach of state oversight requirements, and failure to provide legally binding documentation supporting administrative actions taken under a lapsed license, the board finds the Rolling Mesa Homeowners Association to be inoperable under state law. There was no applause. No outburst. Just the shifting of chairs and the rustle of fabric as 2 decades of unearned authority collapsed in under 10 seconds. The HOA's status as a private governance body was formally revoked, its enforcement rights dissolved, its agreements with infrastructure partners nullified pending a secondary audit. The board members were dismissed from their posts effective immediately, and the association's accounts were frozen under provisional state supervision. It was over, legally, structurally, and beyond repair. After the hearing, Nora didn't linger. She didn't celebrate or speak to reporters, though one was clearly lurking near the parking lot entrance. Instead, she drove home, unlocked her front door, and stood in the center of her living room, breathing in the silence. The house was still. The machine blinked softly in standby mode. The power lines hummed with continuity. Nothing flickered. Nothing threatened. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was living on someone else's grid. The war hadn't ended with shouting. It had ended the only way it could, by taking apart the machine piece by piece until it no longer had the authority to harm. Nora didn't win because she was louder. She won because she had refused to let their silence bury her. Because she made herself undeniable. Because she remembered that legality without ethics is not stability. It's just leverage waiting to be broken. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to feel unfamiliar, not in a threatening way, but as if the artificial shell it had worn for years had finally cracked, revealing something raw and real beneath. With the HOA officially dissolved and the grid contract severed, the energy supply reverted to the municipal provider. No more automated tiering, no more silent overrides, no more vague pamphlets promising optimization while quietly engineering exclusion. The tamper lock on Nora's meter was removed by city technicians without ceremony. No notices were taped to her door. Her backup system was audited, reprogrammed, and certified independent. The rhythm of her days returned, precise, clinical, measured, but beneath that returned a steadier current of something deeper. Peace, not as a feeling, but as a function. Neighbors she'd never spoken to before began appearing, not to pry or console, but to listen. A woman down the street asked for advice on rebuilding her own energy compliance portfolio. A couple 2 blocks over mentioned starting a neighborhood advisory board, not a governing body, just a collaborative circle with open documentation and rotating volunteers. They asked Nora to join. She declined the offer to lead, but agreed to review technical proposals. Her knowledge wasn't a badge, it was a safeguard, and she intended to use it precisely, sparingly, and only when necessary. She never heard from Edgar again. His name vanished from local filings, his profile scrubbed from the development's promotional materials. Rumors whispered that he'd been barred from holding administrative positions in private housing projects for the next 10 years, but she didn't seek confirmation. It didn't matter. The system he built no longer had teeth. What mattered was that her house, the place that once held her hostage with invisible wires and euphemisms, was hers again, fully and without condition. Nora still kept her logs, still monitored the line, still documented everything. Not out of fear, but because she understood now that vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. And she wouldn't let herself forget what it took to dismantle something that was never meant to be questioned. This was not justice in a cinematic sense. No headlines, no confession, no cathartic confrontation. It was quieter, but stronger. A system had tried to edit her life into compliance, and instead, she rewrote its end.